Welcome to the Place Northwest Masterclass podcast series,
where experts share their wisdom on key aspects of the property industry.
We're tackling everything from how to convert a listed building to the best way to hold a public consultation.
Don't miss a single episode. Subscribe now at placenorthwest.co.uk/subscribe
or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Hello, and welcome to the Place Northwest Masterclass podcast series. I'm your host for today's episode, Julia Hatmaker. I'm also the deputy editor at Place Northwest, and today we're going to be talking about how to retrofit, which is a timely topic as we all race towards net zero ambitions. We're going to start by going over the basics. What does it mean to retrofit? Why should we be doing it? And then we'll go over 3 things you should think about before you begin any retrofitting project, whether it's a single house or a mega shopping complex. And we'll conclude by hearing about a successful retrofit project, or maybe a few of them, that puts everything we've learned into practice. And joining me today is James Bruce, director at Civic Engineers, a Manchester-based engineering company with offices in London, Leeds, and Glasgow. James, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Okay, so first things first, can you just walk us through a little bit about what Civic Engineers does?
We, as you mentioned, we're structural engineers in the city centre of Manchester. I'm based in Manchester myself. We have a long-standing proven track record of retrofitting buildings in the city. We've worked on some well-known buildings, such as Band on the Wall, which has just recently reopened. Contact Theatre opened a couple of years ago. Mackie Mayor in the Northern Quarter. And we are also heavily involved in the Mayfield Depot.
Yeah, so like retrofit is kind of y'all's bread and butter, then I guess.
Yes, yeah, you could say that, yeah.
Okay, so first things first, let's get into the basics. What does it mean to retrofit?
So retrofitting is the transformation and reuse of an existing building, whether that's in current use or whether it has fallen into disrepair or has been abandoned. It's bringing it back. It's adding new uses to it, new components to it to make it perform better. It's that you can break it down into 3 kind of primary strands of reuse, which we term either adaptive reuse, which you could say is the repurposing of the building to meet new needs and purposes. It's the simplest form of reuse. You could then move into expansive reuse, so that's the upgrading and the addition of new space to the existing building, maximising its value. This is where we can offer quite a lot of value as structural engineers, whether we're adding stories to an existing building, adding basements to an existing building, which we do a lot of down in London. And then the final part of the definition is proactive reuse, which is a building which is possibly still in use but requires repairs and upgrades. Often that's to the building systems, whether that's incorporating new technologies, repairing or replacing areas that are in poor condition. That's often where operational carbon improvements can be made, which I'm pretty sure you'll be covering under different podcasts.
Yeah, no, we love talking about all things getting rid of carbon. I'm glad that you mentioned that there's 3 different kinds of retrofitting, because I think so many times we think of the dilapidated building that becomes, a new grander version of itself. But just hearing that sometimes it's just about upgrading a building and getting it up to sustainable technology, that's so interesting and important.
Yeah, that's right. There's often environmental benefits to the building being retrofitted, whether that's still in use or abandoned. But there's commercial and social returns as well to it with transforming an existing building. It's quite often far more cost effective for a client to work with what they've got rather than demolishing something or rebuilding it. And buildings are places for people. Quite often occupiers have a connection to that building, and if you're preserving that connection, then they're gonna love that building even more.
Yeah, so retrofitting can help you save on the bottom line down the line when it comes to your product, as well as helping get you some goodwill with those who are attached to the building. What are some other reasons we might retrofit?
So, as we know, built environment is a major contributor to the environmental emergency that the world faces. And demolishing an existing building and replacing it with a new one is just going to continue to stress the finite resources that we have on the planet. Retrofitting a building minimises the waste of the materials that's already in the building, in the frame, in the fabric. But it also it saves the energy that's been invested in building it to get it to that stage, and 50% of the carbon of a building is in the construction of it. So why should we have to redo that? And we should be keeping that investment.
Yeah, so it's not so much about why we should be retrofit, it's all about how we should be retrofit, because retrofit has to happen.
Yeah, that's right. Newly constructed buildings, granted, they're more energy efficient, and we design them to be that. And we do new buildings, but we design them in a way as to be as efficient as possible. But in the UK, 80% of today's buildings are likely to still be occupied in 2050. So it's essential that we have to improve the performance of that towards zero carbon. We can reuse an existing building. We can cut down on the embodied carbon by up to 70% compared to demolishing and rebuilding something. And you have similar yields in lower costs, as we mentioned, but also in timescales and savings in bringing a building back into occupation. It's much quicker to work with what we've got than to rebuild it. And I mentioned the social benefits in vacant important buildings, in impressive buildings, bringing them back into use. Our work at Mackie Mayer in the city centre is a great example of this. Granted, it's historically important. It was the last surviving Smithfield Market building. It was built in 1850s, so it's phenomenally old. But we, working with market operations, we brought that back into use as the Mackie Mayer that we know it is today.
Okay, so you've sold me. We need to retrofit. That brings us to our next section, the need to knows. So what are 3 things that we need to know going into any retrofit project? Just give me one to start out with.
Okay. To start with, we need to understand the existing building. Before we even go anywhere, we need to understand it, not just whether it's a historically important building like Mackie Mayer, any building. And we're working on buildings such as Mackie Mayer back from 1850. We're retrofitting a building that was built in 2007 in the Midlands. So you can do it to any building. They have different levels of retrofitability, even if that's a word, based on when they were built, what they were built out of, why they were built, what their original use was. So our approach to that is, on all those buildings, is a desk-based research. You have to understand the existing building, its form, its materials, its strength, its likely latent defects from construction. And it's really rare that you actually find a set of drawings that tell you all this in one go.
Oh man, I was just about to ask you, are you going through and finding the original blueprints? How do you find all this information?
So you have to build up your own picture. You have to research all available information that we can get. There's ways of doing this, the process called map regression, where you study the historic maps of the building and the site and how that's been developed over the years since it was originally constructed, when it was first built and how it's changed. That can give you, in terms of the timescales of when those changes happened, you can understand what the likely use of materials was, what construction techniques were used at that time. It might give us some clues about the structural capacity that may be redundant in there that we can use to provide any extension or expansion. Similarly, statutory records, planning portal, is publicly accessible. In theory, since 1947, all planning information should be stored in there. Building control, which is private records, but if you need to ask permission from the building owner if you could use those, but they're a fantastic source of information. And since 1996, in theory, CDM regulations requires all clients to be issued with a full set of records from the construction. It's, I say in theory because it's quite often hard to trace those or map them out and find them, often stashed in a cupboard at the back of the building somewhere that no one knows about. And then there's the primary sort of form of research, asking people that use the building, facilities managers that know every nook and cranny. A good example of this was at Contact Theatre, where the facilities manager, Steve, had been in the building for years and years and years, and he knew everything about it, absolutely everything about it. He was a source of information, and we learnt so much just from him, having explored the building and by himself. And it was particularly important because during the previous expansion of Contact Theatre, there was a fire during construction, and because of that, the way the building was built and the expansion that was happening had changed through the construction period, and none of that was in the records of the drawings. So talking to Steve, facilities manager, comparing it against the drawings that were of construction status but weren't, we were able to fill some of those gaps in, as well as doing various surveys, etc., as we went.
Okay, so you have to talk to people.
Talk to people.
Sounds like there's lots of public access documents you can go to find, and you're looking for things like what were the materials that were used, the structure. I'm guessing it's uses as well. Is there anything else that's key to knowing about the building?
Well, once you have all of that information, you have to go in yourself. You have to explore it. You have to experience it yourself. You have to check that information that you've sourced from a desk-based study is actually there. And quite often it is in some form or another, but quite often it has been changed. Whether that's just internal fit-out changes or whether it's something a bit more substantial as a structural change. And then we might start to do opening up works and material testing when we get really into the detailed analysis of an existing building. So it's really important that you get that full picture before you even start thinking about what you're going to do next with the building.
Yeah, it just sounds like the coolest school project ever, because you're going to go do your research, you're going to do your interviews, you're going to do your site visit. It's really dynamic.
It is great. It is one of my favourite parts of a building project as well, is really understanding it. I think on the previous podcast that we did, I talked about the history of Avro and the floorboards of where the workers had been walking round and round of a single piece of machinery for about 100 years. It's just fascinating stuff.
Yes, that's part of our COP26 series. You should go back and listen. It was an excellent episode. Great. So we need to know the story, understanding the history of the building. What is another thing we need to know?
This is slightly difficult to get your head around, but it's about embracing doing nothing. Or not doing nothing, but building nothing.
Okay.
The best way to reduce the carbon footprint of construction is to build nothing. To differentiate between doing nothing and building nothing. So doing nothing is just we stay as we are. The building continues to be disused or to deteriorate. Building nothing is different. Building nothing means we keep what we have, but we repurpose it. We do something different with it. We reimagine its possibilities. We see what future potential it has, but it requires a leap of imagination, creativity, and ingenuity. And our work with the team at Freight Island and the warehouse project at Mayfield Depot is a brilliant example of this. The guys there at Freight Island walked into that space and went, I've got a great idea for this space. That is a leap of imagination. And we worked really hard in terms of engineering challenge to take that existing building, change its use without changing its structure. And we did a lot of analysis, we did a lot of testing to tell the client that we didn't actually need to change the structure. So, do nothing takes a lot of analysis, and it takes a deep understanding of the engineering principles and the thinking of the designer at the time when it was built. We have to, it's part detective work, it's part maths, it's part complex risk analysis on our point in terms of what we think we can use that building for, and understanding the historical form of the building, its construction. It's really important. A doctor can't treat a patient without having studied anatomy. So how can we change a building without studying its history or its change in use? And strangely, the best engineers are the ones that go back to the client and say, you don't need to do anything. But it's really important that the client is experienced and understands how difficult that is to achieve. It might leave some other clients thinking that they've been swindled.
Yeah, maybe.
So it's really important, that relationship and the communication through that journey is really important.
I'm really glad you brought up the analogy of a doctor, because you wouldn't want a doctor to come and see you, give a whole checkup and then go, yeah, so you just need a whole new body. That would be absolutely awful. Exactly. You want them to go you're good. Just, don't do anything drastic. Here's just an idea of things to think about. Maybe you should exercise more, that kind of thing. You mentioned Escape to Freight Island. So I just wanted to go, for our listeners who may not be familiar with it. So it was a train depot. Is that correct?
It's the freight depot for Manchester that stood abandoned and disused since 1970, I think it is, and it's just deteriorated since. We first got involved in the building for the Manchester International Festival, so we studied and checked the building then for a gig that was put on as part of the festival. And then since then, we've got more and more involved with it, learned a bit more about it, understood it a bit further as every year we got involved with Manchester International Festival for a different use. The uses got bigger, the spaces got bigger, and then along came Freight Island, who identified it as a potential venue. We've then been involved with them in bringing Freight Island to what it is now, improving the existing building. I think the only The only major work that we had to do to the building was actually waterproofing the platform level on the top, where previously there was a roof on the building, which obviously kept the platforms dry. That no longer exists, mostly. So we had to waterproof it to stop the water coming down into the space in Freight Island. And that's, in terms of the existing building, the most that we did with it. Everything else was, bringing in the shipping containers or configuring the space internally for the new use.
That's great, because like today it's this very vibrant, space that you go to hang out with your friends. There's all sorts. It's like a food hall almost. There's so many restaurants. There's live entertainment going on. It doesn't feel like a train depot at all.
No, and the space is phenomenal. I don't think there's anyone I've ever taken in there that hasn't walked in, looked up and gone, wow. It is really impressive. It's cathedral-like in terms of volume, and especially if you go through into where the warehouse project actually is. It's an 8,000 capacity venue in there. It just gives you an idea of the scale. It's absolutely huge, and it's in terms of the existing structure, it's hardly been touched in order to change from a freight depot to what it is now.
Okay, so I'm going to do some research. I am going to do nothing. Oh, no, sorry, I'm not going to do nothing. I'm going to build nothing. Very key difference there. I'm going to do something. What is a third thing that I need to know?
So the third thing is thinking more and using less. It's kind of an evolution of build nothing. The challenge is to do as little as possible using new material, and proving what is already there is the best way of doing that. If there's no change of use proposed, then you could assume that the building has been designed adequately for the relevant codes. It's not always the case, but it could be. But you still need to validate that through inspections and surveys. But when there's a change of use, it may result in a load increase from the occupancy loads. There might be new servicing for upgrading the performance of the building from an operational carbon perspective, or changing from a mill building to an office building, for example. There's a big change in loading that's going to be applied to the building. And the challenge is justifying the current floor loadings to today's standards to materials in a building that was built quite often a long time ago, which materials aren't as strong or as stiff as they potentially could be with steel for now, for example. And historic buildings, the older they are, the more likely they're being built based on experience or empirical design, which is still a reasonable approach now. It's basically someone's learned what they've done previously, adapted it, and done it again because it's worked previously.
Oh, thank you for explaining that, because I was about to go, what does that mean?
Today you could call it full-scale prototype testing if you wanted to give it a posh name.
That's very fancy.
But it's still valid. It's how we worked at Mayfield Park, which we've just been working on recently. We deculverted the river, and within that culvert structure there was some existing cast iron beams. So we've repurposed those cast iron beams in the footbridges that now cross the river to give you access from each side of the park. But in doing so, we analysed what was there. So we worked out what the load was that was already loaded onto those cast iron beams, which give us an idea of the capacity that they could take. But we also noticed that driving across that culvert, there'd been various wagons, fully loaded up concrete wagons driving across there. That we harnessed that additional capacity. It'd been proven, they'd driven across it. So we used that to increase the capacity of the bridges that allowed us to reuse them to sit across as pedestrian bridges now.
It sounds like this all comes back to that first point about understanding the history of the building, what you're working with. And then from there, you can really embrace the build nothing and the think more, use less side of things. It also feels like you guys really trust the building in a sense. Like, I guess like for me, I feel like you can be quite snobby about old buildings in the sense of like, oh, they didn't know what they were doing back then. But in actuality, as you mentioned, like they're tried and true. In some cases, you can just reuse what they've already got. You don't have to redo the whole thing.
Yeah, but they're still standing.
Yeah, exactly. Case in point.
They've been used for however many years as this use or that use, or haven't been changed in use. Quite often, they've been changed in use that will have a higher load requirement and not really checked. Avro Bransford Mill is a prime example of that. It's designed as a spinning mill, and then it was used to build planes. There's a slightly different loading requirement there. So trusting the building is a key part of it. It's still there. It's been empirically tested over the years by doing that, similar to what we're talking about with Mayfield bridges. And there's a load balance is the first step that you would actually do. Previous load is this, new load is this. They're the same or less, therefore. step one, that's okay. And then you might start going into the more detailed analysis that we've done to prove that materials are what you thought they were. But yeah, trust the building.
Yeah, it's not blind trust, it's trust based on facts, which is important.
Exactly.
Okay, so this third section that I want to go into is basically looking at all of this in practice. So you mentioned a few examples, and I just want to bring us back to those a little bit. Mackie Mare is what you started us out with. You mentioned that this was something that the community felt really favorable about, kind of helped them out with that. Can you just walk me through that whole project?
So the approach to Mackie Mare was very much a build nothing approach, and when we did have to build something, we tried to do it in a way that was as unintrusive as we could and was also reversible. So I don't know whether you've been in the space, but it's got the central tables, eating space in the middle, and then it's got the stalls, the food and drink stalls around the perimeter, and they're within a new structure that sits that's fixed back to the original cast iron columns. But we were really careful with how we did that. We didn't want to drill into those cast iron columns. They're very brittle to start with. So we designed these clamp fixings that actually clamp around the column to support the new structure off them to avoid having to drill into them. And you can remove that. So if the building evolved again from what it is now into something else, we could remove everything that we've already done now if it suited it, and it would go back to its original form.
I love that so much of retrofit is also about future-proofing in that aspect.
Yeah, it's a fine balance, really, because if you're building a new building now, you're talking about being as lean as possible, using as little material as possible. To some extent, that could limit your future flexibility if you design something so refined for its specific use now that didn't allow us for any future flexibility. We're finding that on a project that we're working on in the Midlands now, that I can't tell you exactly what it is, that's been designed specifically for that use, and we're trying to convert it now into something completely different. But it's been designed specifically for use that on that floor, that on that floor, that on that floor, and that on that floor, that have very different requirements in terms of building structure, load, and converting that into something for a different use is very difficult because it's so refined. It's been repeated and repeated and repeated to get to the minimum amount of material, which is fantastic if it was always going to be used for that use, but it's not anymore.
And you're not going to tell me anything?
No, I can't tell you.
Oh, man. Thought we were going to have a Place Northwest exclusive on the podcast. Okay, another one that you mentioned was Band on the Wall. So tell me about that project.
So Band on the Wall, very important historic music venue in the city centre of Manchester that's recently been expanded to increase the capacity. And because it's history, because of its form of construction, it doesn't necessarily lend itself to its current use. There's a lot of requirements within a music venue for open plan spaces, which, when it's a load-bearing masonry structure, traditional form of construction, it's hard to achieve without a lot of structural intervention. It's also got a retained facade. I don't know whether you know the site, but out the back of it, there was this COSA building that was the whole of the inside of the building had just collapsed on itself, and the facade was left freestanding with a scaffold that had been put up years ago to restrain it. So that was an element of adaptation and retrofit of the existing music venue, but also adding a new part of the structure, threading a new frame down through the existing facade and tying the facade back to the new frame.
I love that one's a combination. Would you say that would be, to go back to your 3 kinds of retrofit, would that be expansive reuse?
Yes, but also proactive reuse, because the existing building is still doing what it did originally. It's been improved, it's been brought up to modern technologies, and there's been investment in systems within the building, but we've also expanded it into an existing building as well. So it's a double whammy retrofit there.
It's exciting. Well, that does bring us to the end of this Masterclass podcast episode. So just to recap, we've learned what retrofit is, that there are 3 different kinds of retrofit. You've got adaptive, expansive, and proactive. You can also do a blend of those. We also learned that retrofit is something that we absolutely have to do. It's not something that we can just think about. Buildings that are being used today need to be retrofit in some aspect in order for us to reach our net zero goals, but also have the buildings that we want in the future. We learned that if we're going to go through a retrofitting project, there's 3 things we need to know. We need to know about the history of the building. There's a whole lot of ways to find that out. We also need to make sure that we're thinking about embracing nothing, making sure that we're not leaping to having to do lots. Instead, we're doing the smart thing, which could be building nothing. And also we're thinking more and possibly doing a little less, using less materials, getting creative, recycling when we can, and reusing things in a different way that may be a little unexpected. So James, thanks so much for teaching our masterclass today.
Thank you for having me.
If you want to learn more about Civic Engineers, head over to civicengineers.com. And if you want to learn more about the built environment, be sure to subscribe to Place Northwest Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you enjoyed it, why not leave us a review? We like them. They're nice. And that is all. Thank you all so much for listening. I'm Julia Hatmaker. Have a good rest of your day. Bye.